The morning the wind carried a veil of red dust across Willow Creek. Hanny Bright stood on a wooden crate behind the front counter of Bright Oven, tacking up a fresh notice. The page flapped stubbornly, as though the air itself wanted to argue with her. Help needed strong hands, good heart. Work in exchange for wages and hot meals. She stepped down, brushed her apron clean of flour, and looked around her little bakery. The place was warm, humming, and alive with the kind of quiet chaos only women could manage before dawn, rolling dough, stoking the big oak-fired oven, and moving sacks of flour that were nearly as heavy as they were. The air smelled of yeast, cinnamon, and a steady determination born from years of making a life with very little. But outside that warm glow was a town growing meaner by the week. News of the proposed ore processing plant had spread like a bad rumor, turning Willow Creek skittish. Cattle ranchers whispered about poisoned water. Farmers muttered about ruined soil. And Hanny herself, who had spoken against the plant at the last town gathering, had earned more than flour-thrown insults for her trouble. The night before, 3 drunken cowhands had pounded on the bakery door long after closing. They weren't looking for bread. Her girls had been frightened young women, with soft hands and soft shoulders, not made for pushing back against rough men. That was why she needed help. A man's presence, even just his shadow, could steady the place. Someone strong enough to haul the 100 ball flour sacks, fix what needed fixing, and if it came to it, stand at the door when someone pounded too hard. But so far, every applicant had been either lazy, drunk, or running from the law. She sighed, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. Lord, send me someone who can lift a sack of flour without complaining, she murmured, or at least someone who won't frighten my girls. She didn't expect an answer, not that morning, not ever. But the wind shifted. Bootsteps sounded on the porch, slow, steady, firm. The kind of steps that meant a man carried his weight evenly, like someone used to walking farther than most folks rode. Honey turned just as the stranger pushed open the door. He stood tall, maybe 6'2", with long black hair, tied loosely at the nape of his neck, a broad chest dusted with the desert's red powder, and the quiet watchfulness of a man who never entered any place unprepared. His boots were worn but cared for, his shirt patched but clean. The line of his jaw was strong, shadowed by several days without shaving, and his eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, met hers. For half a heartbeat, everything in the warm bakery slowed. Flour drifted lazily in the air. The fire crackled softer. Even the chatter of her girls behind her dipped into silence. Then Hanny straightened her spine, as she always did when something in her chest tried to flutter. "Can I help you, sir?" The man removed his hat, not out of courtesy she sensed, but out of habit. "Saw your notice," he said, voice low and even. "Came to ask about the work." His accent was soft, but unmistakably Apache. Hanny felt the weight of it, not fear, not prejudice, but an awareness of how this town tended to look at men like him. Willow Creek wasn't known for kindness toward native folks. And yet, something in his manner held no threat, only a kind of patient gravity, like he'd carried burdens bigger than this dusty little town could imagine. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, not out of deception she sensed, but caution. Then he said, "Edward. Edward Nez." "Well, Edward Nez," Hanny said, wiping her hands on her apron. "We could use someone with strong arms, and someone who doesn't mind early mornings." A quiet rumble of a laugh barely there escaped him. "Early mornings are familiar." She grabbed a sack of flour from the stack nearby, trying to lift it as demonstration. It barely budged. Without a word, Edward stepped forward, took the sack with one hand, and hoisted it onto his shoulder, as though it weighed no more than a bundle of rags. The girls behind her gasped. Hanny nodded slowly, hiding her impressed smile. All right, you can lift. She pointed to the back of the shop. Door hinge broke again. Think you can manage it? Edward set the flower down gently, walked to the hinge, and examined it with a sharp, practiced eye. From his belt pouch, he drew a small bone-handled tool, carved with patterns she didn't recognize, and in less than a minute, the hinge sat straighter than she'd ever seen it. He stepped back. Won't creak now. And it didn't. Something warm uncurled in her chest, unexpected and unsettling. Thank you. He dipped his head, then looked around the bakery, slowly taking in each woman, each corner, each crack in the walls without judgment, only understanding. The kind a man learned from spending long years reading Land and People. I'll take the job, he said simply. Annie swallowed. All right then. Pay is fair, meals included. Girls here work hard, so I don't allow trouble. You give them no reason to fear you, and we'll get along fine. Edward met her eyes with a quiet solemnity. No one here needs to fear me. And there was something in the way he said it, soft, almost sad, that made her wonder what kind of life he'd walked through before stepping into her bakery. But she didn't pry. People in the West came with secrets. You learn to respect them, or lose good folk. Well then, she said, offering her hand. Welcome to Bright Oven. His hand closed around hers, warm, strong, steady. A simple handshake. Yet Annie felt, in some place she couldn't name, that she had just opened her door to more than a hired hand. Something had shifted in Willow Creek that morning, quiet as red dust settling, certain as the sun rising over desert stone. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, as warm and steady as the big oak oven in Bright Oven. Dawn came with pale gold light stretching over the rooftops, catching on the dust that never truly left Willow Creek. The bakery woke earlier, now that there was a man in the back room, lifting flour, splitting kindling, and fixing what had been left broken for too long. Edward Niz worked without complaint. He didn't boast, didn't hurry, and didn't waste even half a movement. The women who had once tiptoed around him now carried on their chatter, glancing his way only when a crate needed moving. Even the shyest girl, Maggie, no longer flinched when he passed behind her. Still, Annie sensed something coiled behind his quiet. An alertness, a listening, a watchfulness, like a man who expected trouble, even in a room full of cinnamon and sugar. And trouble had indeed been brewing. Willow Creek talked of little else but the ore processing plant Hale Mining intended to build down along the river. A place that once fed cattle and watered rows of beans would soon be choked with tailings and waste. Annie had seen enough to stand against it. Old Mature, Turner's creekside field, had already turned sour from early ore washing upstream. His cattle were drinking less. The alfalfa wilted around the edges. Annie brought her concerns to the town meeting, nervous, heart pounding. She'd expected resistance, but she hadn't expected to be laughed at by men who never had to knead dough or gather clean water before sunrise. The lady baker thinks she knows more than engineers, Vernon Hale had said, leaning on his cane made from polished horn. Pretty thing like you shouldn't trouble yourself with man's business. The memory still burned hot in her chest. And ever since she spoke out, the bakery had become a target. First, it was crude words scrawled on her window. Then rocks 3 in one night, shattering the small panes she'd saved weeks to install. One evening, 2 men, drunk on rye whiskey, had pounded the back door until Maggie cried. But that night, Edward had stepped from the shadows. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his fists. He simply stood, big and immovable as an old pine in winter. The men backed away, after one look at him, a look that said he'd seen their kind before and did not fear them. When Annie thanked him later, he only shook his head. No thanks needed. but she saw the faint scrape on his knuckle, as though one of those men had tested him before retreating. A week passed, the mornings colder, the evenings filled with uneasy whispers. Hanny noticed Edward walk the perimeter of the bakery before locking up each night. He paused at corners most men never looked at. He listened to the wind as if it carried tracks instead of dust. Once, when she brought him a mug of warm coffee during the early dark hours, she found him crouched near the back step. "What is it?" she whispered. He pointed toward the ground. "Footprints. 3 sets. Not yours." Her stomach tightened. "When?" "Last night," he said. They stayed a while. A shiver crept up her arms despite the heat of the cup she held. Edward stood. His voice softened, though his eyes didn't. "You should lock the door sooner and keep the lamp burning." "Do you think they'll come back?" He didn't answer. That itself was an answer. Still, she refused to let fear take up space in her bakery. So she focused on her work and her women, keeping spirits high, checking the locks twice, sometimes 3 times. But she could not ignore the way Edward had begun watching the street as he chopped wood, or how he lingered near the windows when shadows stretched long. One night, after the others had gone home, Hanny found Edward quietly repairing a jammed drawer beside the flour bins. The soft glow of a kerosene lamp flickered over his hands. His shirt sleeves were rolled, showing strong forearms marked with faint scars, some long ago, some not so old. As he worked, a small object slid from beneath his collar, a leather cord, woven in a pattern she didn't recognize, with a carved bone pendant shaped like flowing water. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and older than anything one could buy in Willow Creek's trading post. She realized then that he wasn't merely a drifter. The way he moved, the way he looked outward instead of inward. A man shaped by lands much bigger than this town, by responsibilities she couldn't name. He felt her gaze and tucked the pendant back beneath his shirt. "Didn't mean to stare," she said softly. "It just caught the light." "It's nothing," he murmured. But his voice held the weight of a man who carried too many secrets. Hanny wanted to ask more, but she had learned long ago that the West was built on unspoken things. So instead, she offered him a bowl of the fresh peach cobbler she'd made for the morning crowd. He accepted it with a nod, sitting at the far end of the table like someone who had spent years eating alone. After a quiet moment, Hanny tried a smile. "Do you ever get tired of being so serious?" He looked up, startled, not offended. She continued, "You're always working, always fixing things, always watching. Do you ever just rest, Edward?" His gaze lingered on her for a long second. Then, "I rest when the ground is quiet," he said. "Lately it hasn't been." His words chilled her, not because of what he said, but because of how certain he was. Trouble wasn't just near, it was already circling. The next morning, as she swept the storefront, Hanny spotted 2 men she didn't recognize leaning against a hitching post across the road, pretending to smoke while their eyes stayed fixed on Bright Oven. Their clothes were clean, their boots were new, they weren't drifters, they were scent. Hanny inhaled sharply, and when she turned, she found Edward standing behind her, not close enough to startle her, but close enough that she felt steadier. He followed her gaze toward the men, then back to her. His voice was quiet, but iron strong. "They're watching you. I know. You shouldn't face this alone." Something warm, something dangerous stirred in her chest. "Then it's good you're here," she whispered. Edward didn't smile, but something in the set of his shoulders softened, as though he had been waiting for those words. And for the first time, Hanny understood. This man had not wandered into her bakery by accident. Whether she knew it or not, whether he admitted it or not, Their fates had already begun to draw together like flour and water under steady odds. The night the truth crept into Hanny Bright's life did not arrive with gunfire or shattered glass. It came instead on soft moccasin steps in the alley, behind Bright Oven, so quiet the wind almost carried them away. It was near closing time. The lamps were low, the air warm with the scent of cooling bread. Hanny was wiping down the counter when she heard a murmur, low, rhythmic, not English. She froze, listening. The voices came from behind the bakery, where only Edward stored lumber and broken crates. Her heartbeat quickened, not with fear, but with a strange intuition. Something was wrong, or perhaps something long hidden was finally coming into the light. She moved quietly through the kitchen, pushing open the back door just a sliver. What she saw stole her breath. 4 Apache men stood in a half circle, shadows cast long under the moonlight. Their hair was braided, their clothes dusted by long travel, and at the center of them stood Edward. His posture was different, no longer the quiet hired hand tending to flour sacks, but a man who belonged among warriors. A man who had once stood in front of people expecting him to lead. One of the men spoke in Apache, the tone urgent, almost pleading. The others bowed their heads. Edward stared at the ground, fists at his sides. Tension cut into the lines of his shoulders. Hanny pushed the door open a little more, just enough for the hinge to creak. All 4 men stiffened. Edward turned first, every muscle coiling as if to shield her. Hanny? His voice was still low in volume, but something sharper rested beneath it. You should be inside. I heard voices, she murmured. I didn't mean to intrude. The oldest of the Apache men stepped forward, lifting his chin. His gaze held strength without hostility. We come for Nez, he said in accented but clear English. His place is not here. Hanny blinked. Here? At the bakery? The man's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her, perhaps surprised she would speak so plainly. Edward stepped between them, before the tension could thicken. Go inside, Hanny. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was chiseled from the same stone that shaped mountains firm, immovable. She shook her head. No, not until you tell me what this is. Edward didn't move for several seconds. The silence throbbed like a heartbeat between them. Finally, he exhaled, turning to the men. Give me a moment. They exchanged glances, then stepped back into shadow. Edward faced her fully then. His features softened, though strain still clung to the edges. I should have told you, he said. But I didn't want to bring trouble to your door. Hanny crossed her arms not in anger, but in steadiness. Edward, who are you really? He looked toward the distant hills, where moonlit ridges traced the outline of Apache land. His voice, when it came, felt older than he was. My name is Edward Nez, but among my people, it carries more weight. He paused. I was born to be heir to the council of the Inde. Hanny swallowed, hard. An heir, she repeated softly. He nodded. I was trained to lead, trained to watch the land, to speak for our people. But years ago, after a raid, things went wrong. My brother died in a fight that shouldn't have happened. It was a choice I made to push too far, to trust the wrong whisper. They wanted me to take my brother's place at the council fire, but I couldn't carry that weight. Not then. His voice faltered, just enough for her to hear the scar beneath the words. So I left, he finished. I walked away from who I was supposed to be. Hanny stepped closer, her heartbeat steadying with something new. Not fear, but understanding. Empathy. And now they want you back. Yes. He breathed out slowly. Because the plant hail is building. It will poison the river that runs through our land. Through yours too. If the water dies, we all do. Truth hit her like a strike of lightning to dry land. You knew, she whispered, From the start. I suspected. His gaze met hers. You were already standing against them. I didn't want to pull you deeper into danger. A small aching smile touched her lips. Edward, I walked into danger the moment I signed that petition. At least tell me the man helping haul my flour sacks is the same man fighting for his people. He blinked slow, almost startled by the gentleness of her tone. I am both, he finally said. The admission seemed to loosen something in him, like a knot pulled free after years of tension. Annie looked toward the shadows where the Apache men waited. Then let me help, she said. We want the same thing to protect this town and your people's land. Edward's jaw worked as though the words lodged somewhere deep. You don't understand what you're asking. Standing with me means standing against Hale, the mayor, maybe even the soldiers at Fort Laramie. They won't listen. They won't care. Hale already tried to frighten me, she said softly. If fear was going to stop me, it would have done so weeks ago. Her voice trembled only at the end, he noticed. Of course he did, but he didn't mistake it for weakness. Honey Bright had courage woven into her bones. He looked at her for a long, weighty moment. The wind brushed dust across their boots. The lamp inside flickered behind her, warming the doorway. Then Edward said the words that would shape everything to come. Very well. We stand together. Annie felt the air change, like the shift before a storm, not dread, but inevitability. He turned and signaled for the Apache men to return. They approached cautiously, studying her with unreadable expressions. This woman, Edward told them in Apache before translating, is with us. She fights for the water, for the land. She is not an enemy. The eldest man bowed his head slightly toward her. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was respect. What now? Annie asked quietly. Now, Edward said, we gather truth and men willing to speak it. Your townfolk have voices, my people have evidence. Together, we might be strong enough. And Hale, she murmured. Edward's eyes hardened, the softness replaced by the fire of a leader he never meant to be. Hale will come for us, he said, but we'll be ready. A gust of desert wind swept through the alley, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant storms. For the first time since she'd hung that help-wanted notice, Annie realized she had not only hired a man for her bakery, she had stepped into a battle that belonged to far more than Willow Creek. And Edward Nez, heir to a people, shadow of a past, was now bound to her by a cause neither could walk away from. The days after Edward revealed his true identity unfurled like tight wire, thin, tense, ready to snap under the wrong weight. Willow Creek looked the same on the surface. Dusty streets, hitching posts crowded at dusk, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing through the afternoon heat. But beneath porch whispers, behind shuttered windows, fear had begun to churn. And Hale Mining felt that fear slipping from its grip. It didn't take long for Vernon Hale to respond. First came the warnings. A smashed lantern left at Bright Oven's doorstep. A note scrawled in charcoal, bake your bread, not trouble. Bootprints circling the back door again, deeper this time, made by heavier men. Edward kept watch, quietly, constantly. When the girls swept up broken glass, he checked the alley. When Annie measured flour, he studied the street. When she locked up at night, he was already at the door, lamp in hand. But danger didn't always come quietly. One evening, long after the stars had risen, Annie was closing the stockroom when she smelled smoke, sharp, bitter, wrong. Not the warm wood smoke of her oven, but something acrid. Burning tar, burning rope. Edward, she called. He appeared instantly, tension flashing across his face. He didn't waste a breath. He ran toward the back. Annie followed, heart hammering. The storage shed, the one holding wheat sacks, dried fruit, and precious sugar, was ablaze. Flames licked up the walls like hungry tongues. Sparks spat into the night. Annie gasped. No, no, please. Edward grabbed a water barrel and heaved it without hesitation. Water hissed against the fire, but the blaze only coughed louder, as if fueled by something more than dry wood. Annie, he shouted, get back. A beam cracked, spraying embers. One landed on her sleeve, and she stumbled as she swatted it away. Smoke rolled thick through the air, stinging her eyes. Edward saw her falter and charged through the choking haze, reaching her before she could fall. His arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her clear just as the shed groaned and part of the roof collapsed inward. For a moment, all she could hear was the thunder of his breathing and the roar of the fire behind them. You hurt? His voice was rough, breathless. She shook her head, though her heart felt bruised from pounding so hard. No. But the shed, Edward, it's all, I know. His jaw tightened. This wasn't an accident. And she knew he was right. The fire had burned too hot, too fast. Someone had meant for it to take everything. Someone wanted the bakery to fall. Later that night, when the flames had died to steaming rubble, and the townsfolk drifted away murmuring apologies and useless comfort, Annie sat at one of the bakery tables. Her shoulders slumped, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to clean soot from her arms. Edward returned from checking the alley behind the ruined shed. His shirt sleeve was torn, revealing a fresh scrape down his forearm. He didn't seem to notice it. You should rest, he said. I can't, she whispered. What if they come back? What if they try again? They will. His honesty was never cruel, just true. Hale needs to scare you into silence. She looked up sharply. And if I don't stay silent? His gaze held hers, steady as stone. Then you'll need someone beside you who understands what it means to stand against a man who takes what isn't his. She swallowed. You mean you. A beat. Then he nodded. Annie reached for the cloth on the table. Let me clean that. She pointed to his arm. He hesitated an odd, vulnerable pause before stepping closer. She dabbed gently at the scrape, her fingers brushing warm skin. Edward didn't flinch, but she felt the small hitch in his breath. You've had worse, she said softly. Too many times. His voice was almost a whisper. Violence follows men who carry certain names, even when they try to leave those names behind. She paused, cloth still in hand. Edward, you didn't leave because you were weak. You left because you cared too much to watch more people die. His jaw tightened, eyes lowering. I made a call that cost my brother's life. Caring didn't save him. Annie set the cloth down, her hand hovering near his, but not touching, letting him decide the distance. You're not the man who made that mistake anymore, she said. You're the man who ran into fire tonight to save me. The man who protects what matters. For the first time since she'd known him, his guard wavered. Not dropped, Edward Nez. Did not drop his guard, but wavered enough for her to see grief beneath it. And loneliness. And a depth of loyalty that frightened him more than flames ever could. Slowly, he met her eyes. And what if what matters is you? He asked quietly. Her breath caught. The bakery felt suddenly too small, the lamplight too soft. Then, she whispered, we fight together. A knock jolted the moment apart, two sharp raps, urgent. Edward stiffened. Annie straightened. Through the window, they saw a young Apache boy, no more than 15, breathless and dusty from travel. Edward opened the door. They know, the boy gasped. Hale knows you're helping the white woman. He's sending men. They plan to crush the petition meeting tomorrow, and they brought rifles. Annie felt a chill coil down her spine. Edward stepped forward, fierce and calm all at once. Tell the council I heard. The boy ran back into the night. Edward closed the door, then faced Annie. His words were steady. "It begins tomorrow." She nodded, her fingers trembling, then settling. "Then we'll be ready." Outside, the night wind swept over Willow Creek like a warning. Inside, Edward and Hanny stood side by side, not just baker and hired hand, not just woman and Apache heir, but two people bound now by danger, conviction, and something fragile beginning to rise between them, like dough left to warm in the quiet of dawn. Dawn broke over Willow Creek in a thin strip of pale silver, a nervous kind of light that felt more like a warning than a beginning. The petition meeting was scheduled for late afternoon, but word had already spread. Hale's men would be there, armed, angry, and determined to shut it down. Hanny woke early, the remnants of smoke still in her hair from the shed fire. She had barely slept, yet purpose moved her hands with steady force as she loaded trays of bread and biscuits onto the counter. If the town was going to fight for its land, they might as well do so with food in their bellies and the smell of something warm to remind them what they were protecting. Edward entered the bakery silently, as he always did, though today there was a weight to him, shoulders squared, eyes colder than morning frost. He had seen too many conflicts to underestimate what might happen. "You shouldn't come today," he said as he checked the bolts on the back door, "and let them scare me out of my own town." Hanny tied her apron tighter. Not a chance. His gaze rested on her a long moment. Then, in a voice low enough for only her to hear, "Stay close to me." She nodded. By mid-afternoon, townsfolk began gathering in the open yard beside the old whitewashed church. Hanny carried 2 baskets of bread. Edward walked beside her like a silent shadow. Women from Bright Oven arrived too. Maggie, Clara, Louise, each with a determined set to her jaw. Several of the Apache Council members waited near the church steps, holding documents about land studies, water samples, and maps of the river's path. For a moment, it seemed hopeful, white settlers and Apache elders standing together, something Willow Creek had never seen. Then the riders appeared, 6 of them, dust rising behind their horses like soak from dry grease. They wore clean boots, dark hats pulled low, rifles slung on shoulders, Hale's hired muscle. And at their center, on a pale gray gelding, sat Vernon Hale himself. His suit was crisp despite the heat, his eyes sharp as flint. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hale drawled, dismounting, "I hear you've all gathered to oppose progress." A murmur rippled through the crowd, uneasy and tense. Hanny stepped forward, clutching the petition sheets. "We're here to protect our land. The river feeds this town." Hale cut her off with a smooth, oily smile. "Miss Bright, you bake fine bread. Leave the politics to men who understand them." Before Hanny could respond, Edward stepped into Hale's line of sight. The crowd fell quiet instantly. Something about the way Edward stood, not threatening, but rooted, made even the armed men shift uneasily. Hale's smile twisted. "Ah, the Apache stray. I wondered when you'd show your face." Edward's voice was calm. "My people live on this land. We have the right to fight through it." "Your people," Hale sneered, "have lived off the charity of this government for years." Hanny saw the flicker of pain in Edward's eyes, the kind a man carries from generations behind him. She stepped closer, her voice firm. "No one here needs your permission to defend what's ours." Murmurs of agreement rose, tentative at first, then stronger. The tension swelled, then snapped. One of Hale's men moved toward the church door, pulling something from his saddlebag. Edward caught the motion instantly. "That's not a survey tool," he muttered. "He's planting something." Hanny's stomach dropped. "You mean?" "Yes." Edward lunged, silent, swift, trained as if danger were an old companion. He reached the man just as a fuse flickered between his fingers. The two collided in a cloud of dust. The rifleman swung the butt of his gun toward Edward's temple, but Edward ducked, grabbed his wrist and twisted sharply. The man cried out as the fuse dropped harmlessly into the dirt. Chaos erupted. Women screamed. Men dragged their children back. Hale shouted orders. Two of the other hired guns raised their rifles, aiming blindly into the crowd. Hanny froze until Maggie yanked her behind a water trough. One of the Apache elders blew a shrill whistle to call his men forward. And amid the panic, Edward wrestled the saboteur to the ground, pinning him with a forearm across the chest. He held up the small explosive stick for all to see. "This is Hale's progress," he shouted. Gasps rippled across the gathering. Vernon Hale's face turned a deadly shade of red. "That's a lie, you planted that." But the evidence was undeniable. The fuse, the powder, the timing, it all pointed to sabotage, meant to frame the Apache for violence. Sheriff Duncan, who had lingered at the meeting's edge uncertainly, finally stepped forward. He picked up the explosive from Edward's hand and examined it. "Hale," the sheriff said slowly, "you want to explain why your man had blasting powder at a peaceful gathering?" Hale sputtered, stepped back, then bolted for his horse, but the Apache councilman blocked his path. His hired guns dropped their rifles rather than free-face the sheriff and 20 furious townsfolk. It was over. Not with bloodshed, but with truth cracking open like a long dry riverbed finding water again. As the crowd dispersed, shaken but resolute, Hanny found Edward standing beside the church, chest rising and falling in quiet exhaustion. A streak of dust ran across his cheekbone. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something steadier, calmer. She walked up to him. "You saved us." He shook his head. "We saved each other." Behind them, the sheriff was placing Hale and the remaining henchmen into custody. Citizens of Willow Creek approached the Apache elders with outstretched hands, offering apologies, thanks, promises. Something new had begun, fragile but real. Edward glanced at Hanny. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "our town and my people will have to decide what comes next." She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against his soot-streaked hand. "Then we'll face it together." For the first time, Edward allowed a small smile, shy, tired, but genuine. And for the first time, Hanny felt hope not just for Willow Creek, but for herself. Willow Creek woke the next morning feeling lighter than it had in months, though the ski was still the same shade of dusty rose, and the desert wind still carried grit that stuck beneath one's collar. What had changed wasn't the land, it was the people on it. Word of Hale's arrest spread quickly. By breakfast, ranchers rode into town to shake Edward's hand. Farmers brought jars of preserved peaches to Bright Oven as thanks to Hanny. Even old Mrs. Leary, who seldom trusted anyone younger than 60, brought a bundle of clean rags, muttering something about standing up to devils in suits. But it wasn't celebration that drove people, it was rebuilding. The storage shed behind Bright Oven had burned nearly to its bones. Hanny stood before the charred remains, hands on her hips, a mixture of grief and determination pushing through her chest. Without the shed, she couldn't store ingredients for the week's orders. And without Bright Oven running, many of the town's women lost their work. She exhaled shakily. "We'll rebuild it, somehow." A shadow fell beside her. Edward. He studied the wreckage with calm eyes, then looked toward the horizon where a cluster of Apache riders approached. Among them was Elder Nantan, the old man who'd spoken sharply the night he came for Edward. "They heard what happened," Edward said quietly. "They came to help." Hanny blinked, surprised. "Help us?" He nodded. Moments later, Apache men dismounted, silent but resolute. Behind them came townsfolk carrying lumber, nails, and buckets of water. No one spoke of divisions or difference. They simply converged on the broken shed, as if they'd done so all their lives. Hanny watched tears prick her eyes. For the first time since she'd opened Bright Oven, She felt the town wasn't just a place she worked to keep alive. It was a place that wanted to keep her alive too. Edward stepped beside her, sleeves rolled, offering a small nod toward the hammer she held. "Shall we?" he asked. She gave a soft laugh. "You'll be fixing my mistakes all day." "Good," he said. "Gives me a reason to stay." The words were simple, but something in his voice, gentle, steady, almost hopeful, lingered in her chest long after they turned to work. By noon, Bright Oven rang with the rhythm of hammers. The new shed rose faster than the old one ever had. Children carried small planks, women hauled water for mixing clay. Apache craftsmen cut beams with practiced efficiency, Edward among them, working with a quiet pride that seemed older than his years. Every time he passed Honey aboard or steadied a post for her, their fingers brushed, not by accident, not by boldness, but with a kind of careful intention neither dared speak aloud. When the last beam settled into place, cheers rose across the yard. Maggie threw her arms around Hanny. Louise wiped tears with her apron. Townsfolk shook hands with the Apache elders, awkward at first, then easier. Hanny stood in the middle of it all, her heart swelling so full she feared it might spill over. Edward approached. Dust streaked across his face, but there was a glow in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Something unburdened, something free. "You did this," he said quietly. "No," she answered with a smile. "We did." He looked away, unable to hide the warmth creeping into his expression. "You should see the inside," she continued, nodding toward the new shed. "It's bigger than the old one." "I know," he said. "You'll need space for what comes next." She tilted her head. "And what's that?" He didn't answer, just motioned toward the bakery door. "Come inside. There's something I want to tell you." The bakery smelled of rising dough and warm sugar as they entered. Afternoon sun poured through the windows, turning the flour floating in the air into tiny drifting stars. Edward stood in the center of the kitchen, oddly hesitant, as though he didn't know where his son belonged. Finally, he rested them lightly against the wooden table. "Hanny," he began slowly, "the council met last night after Hale's arrest. They want me to return, to take the seat my brother left." She grew still. "And will you?" she asked gently. "I told them no." Her breath caught. "Edward." "I left once because I wasn't ready to lead," he said, "because I thought all a leader could do was fight." He took a slow breath. "But standing with you, standing with this town, I learned something different. Strength isn't only in battle. It's in protecting what's worth keeping, in building something instead of burning it." He stepped closer, voice softening. "You showed me that." Warmth spread through her chest like rising dough. "And there's more," he said, lifting his gaze to hers. "I also told them I'd stay near Willow Creek. Not to be a chief, but to be a bridge. Someone who helps our people and yours work together." Her heart beat faster. "And you," he continued, "you showed me how two worlds can meet without breaking. If the land is to heal, if our people are to trust each other, I want to be part of that." Hanny swallowed hard. "Edward, I never asked you to stay." "I know." He smiled faintly. "That's why I want to." The room fell quiet. The only sound was the low, content purr of the oven. Hanny stepped closer, flour dusting her hands like pale gold. "I'm glad you're staying," she whispered. "For Willow Creek. For your people." Her voice softened even more. "For me." If the world outside had collapsed, she doubted either of them would have noticed. Edward reached out, gently brushing a stray smear of flour from her cheek. "I don't know what comes next," he said, "but I know where I want to begin." She laid her hand over his. "Right here," she murmured. "Yes, us," he breathed. And in the warm hush of Bright Oven, where bread rose and the world outside finally rested, Hanny Bright leaned into the quiet promise between them, the kind of promise that didn't need grand gestures or spoken vows. A promise born in fire survived. A promise built in flower and courage. A promise that would carry Willow Creek, the Apache people, and the two hearts, standing side by side, into a future gentler than the past had ever allowed.